Chapter 6. Wednesday dinner time. As they sat down to eat, and boy was she proud of the fact that her second attempt was damn near as perfect as the first, Mac looked at the big business-size envelope beside their plates. Johnny Jordan? He frowned. Why does that name sound familiar? Shoot. I don't know, she mumbled. Do you know that name? He glanced at her sideways as he took a bite of the omelet. First, the omelet is divine. You did a great job. She beamed at him. It's not as hard as I thought. Nothing is, he said. You just have to learn how. She hoped so. But she didn't have the confidence yet to make that discernment. Then he said, and second, you're up to something. She sat back with a sigh. How do you know? He snickered. Because you get this weird little glare in your eyes and a wrinkle in your forehead as you bring your brows together. And it's almost always directed at me, as if to say, I don't know what you're talking about. She glared at him, but could feel the wrinkles forming between her eyebrows. She reached up and eased them back. His grin just widened. She glared at him once more. I'm not up to anything. Well, you just admitted you were, he said. Not really, she said. But I do have an odd request. She patted her pocket and pulled out the letter and handed it to him. As he popped another bite into his mouth, he picked it up and read it. His eyebrows rose toward his hairline. Wow. Now they're bypassing the police and coming straight to you. He shook his head. What the hell will you do with this? Do you realize how dangerous this could be for you? He looked at the letter again, then at the envelope. Did she mail you that too? She groaned and sat back. No, I didn't know what to do, she said, so I called her. The end result is, she was here this afternoon and dropped off that envelope. I did warn her that I could probably tell her nothing because not only was it a long time ago, but no crime scene was found. And no further word came from the young man in all these years. For all we know, it was possible he drowned, but he went missing after the heavy flooding that year. So it was doubtful he ended up in the lake. She let Mac ponder that for a moment, then added, the dagger Penny was concerned about is in the bigger envelope she left with me earlier today. She tapped the big business envelope on the kitchen table. Yeah, for a while there, he said, they were doing these stabbing it into the ground as hard as they could kinds of things. Like darts but downward with knives. It was a cool move but wasn't very good for the blades. He looked at the envelope. You haven't opened it yet? She shook her head. Muggs had just found whatever was under the bed when she arrived. I had to run downstairs and after she left, I set the alarm and came back upstairs. Then you came. You know what? For somebody who has nothing going on, he said slightly sarcastically, you're sure busy. She nodded. Almost too busy, she admitted. But that's all right because it's pretty hard to not love life right now. The trick is there any way to figure out what happened to this poor Johnny guy? I didn't know the family well. I can't recall much about the cold case. I remember opening it at some point, but there was nothing new to move forward with. No, she said, and I'm not sure there is now either. It's a hard case. I'm also not sure what clues might be found in the witness statements either. So many witnesses have died. She hesitated. I can't read the statements in the police file, can I? He shook his head. She nodded. That's what I expected. His girlfriend from around that time died of breast cancer last year. And his brother is gone now too. That is sad because then his brother never got closure, and even the girlfriend must have always wondered right up to the end. She certainly didn't leave any confession saying she'd murdered him, Doreen said dryly. To date, we have no reason or no evidence to think Johnny was murdered, Mac said. That was an excellent omelet. He slid the last bite in his mouth, put down his fork and pushed back his plate. The young man could have just gotten up and walked away. I get that, Doreen said. But what would make a young man do that? What makes somebody who is close to his brother, and we only have his brother's wife's word on that, but supposedly close to his brother and his sister-in-law, yet who gets up and walks away forever? I think at the time they leave, they plan on returning, riding high on some future big successful wave. When that doesn't happen, they don't want the family to know they are a failure. A lot of people, after too much time has gone by, don't know what to say anymore, so they never say anything. Meaning they don't return either. That's very sad, Doreen said. Somebody has to know what happened to Johnny. There's always another option, he said quietly. You have to consider that, even though we have much higher statistics today, still an awful lot of suicides of young men happened back then. Wouldn't his body have shown up, though? Mac frowned. Thinking about that, he pushed back his chair and looked at her. Do you mind if I put on a pot of coffee? Please, she said. She collected the dishes and walked to the sink. I mean, surely if he'd shot himself, jumped off the bridge, or I don't know. I guess one of the favorite ways is a drug overdose or even driving into a semi coming down the highway or something, there would be a body. Obviously, I don't know anything about committing suicide, but there's always a body left behind. There's almost always a body, Mac corrected. But we don't always find everybody who is lost at sea, like we don't always find everybody who's been lost in the lake. Right, she said. And if you think about all the country backroads we have here, all kinds of places exist where Johnny may have gone for a joyride and driven off into a ravine. She stopped what she was doing, turned around and looked at him. Do you think even after 29 years that would still hold true? Of course it would, he said. Think about the miles and miles of roads around here. And what would have been seen back then wouldn't necessarily be seen now, considering all the natural growth since then. Maturing trees and bushes can hide a lot. But we have satellite now, she argued. People have drones traveling all over the place. Sure. That doesn't necessarily mean they know what they're looking at, because a piece of shiny metal doesn't mean a vehicle is stuck underneath there. Besides, did Johnny have his own vehicle? I forgot to ask Penny, she said. She's sending all the digital files to my email too. Forward them to me as well, he said. I'll take a look at what's in the police files again. I'm not promising anything, but if something pops, maybe it's due to a communication error. Unfortunately, we've seen that happen with cold cases too. What do you mean by communication error? Different departments don't share info. Particularly back then. What if Johnny headed to Vancouver and got absorbed into the big city life? He could be homeless. He could have been a John Doe in the morgue. We didn't have any automatic way to check across multiple jurisdictions. It had to be done manually. What if we got something of George's? Could we run DNA and check through some database to see if his brother has shown up elsewhere? We could, except there's no budget money for things like that, Max said. In a perfect world, we'd have lots of money, and we could run DNA for every missing family member. And even if something still exists of the brother's DNA to check, sometimes it's not a close enough match to ID a sibling. Doreen sighed. I know Penny is hoping to put her house on the market, but she hasn't done a heavy clean-out yet. Maybe if she kept a locket with strands of her husband's hair, we should ask her to preserve it, just in case. Back then, DNA had to be directly collected from the missing person. So some evidence of Johnny's DNA might be hanging around related to his missing person file. That would be evidence, wouldn't it? Obviously, he said. But unfortunately, stuff goes missing. So, when I return to the office tomorrow, I'll take a look and see if we have anything on file. And you might want to send Penny an email, asking her if she has anything of her husband's. A hairbrush would be ideal. Right. How much do you need? Not too much, he said. But we do need something. Hair, nail, skin, blood tissue, bone. Things like that. She wrinkled her nose at him. What if he was cremated? I doubt there'd be much left in that case. Possibly not, he said. It depends if she kept the ashes. She did. The urn is on her mantel. Can you get DNA from the ashes? He shrugged. I'm not sure. I hear bone fragments remain, even with cremations at high heat. Bones retain DNA. However, in most cases, those remaining fragments are ground to ash before being handed over. I don't know that the ashes can be tested for DNA. It seems like DNA testing is moving forward in leaps and bounds, and nobody knows what we can get from whatever until the test is done. Now they're doing ancestry DNA, and that's making huge changes in cold cases. But in this case, we don't have any foul play suspected. So we have no suspects to go after, like a killer. If you mean that we don't have any DNA of a killer at a crime scene, you're quite right. We don't even have a crime scene. All we have is that this young man got up one day and walked away. Supposedly. What about the dagger? Same problem, he said. Found years later, buried in the ground. When we opened the missing persons case, no DNA testing was really done back then. Great advances have been made, so who knows what it'll tell us now. It's a knife that Johnny owned, that he played with all the time. Of course he cut himself on it. Everybody would have at least once. She sighed. I get that, but it just seems like if somebody had murdered him with a dagger, there would be skin cells of whoever killed him. Maybe, he said. But I doubt it after all that time. Right, but can they test for other tissue? Lab tests can certainly separate different people's DNA, plus what kind of tissue was found for each person, he said. As in semen versus epithelial versus hair, for example. She nodded. I just don't know enough about it, but at least I have the knife, and no, I know it won't be of much value. I think what Penny is really hoping for is that her brother-in-law won't be forgotten. That's the hardest thing for any cold case file. It's a cold case to the public. But it's never cold to the family. It just sits there forever. That's why she hung on to the dagger. It's a reminder. Not just of Johnny but of his life, and probably his death. Of all that's hanging over her life all this time. He stared at her. And seriously? A dagger in the Dahlias? They had a bench in the backyard where Johnny was last seen. It became something they found very difficult to look at. So they moved it and were digging a new bed and putting in Dahlias when they found his dagger. Which makes sense if he always sat there. I agree, she said with a shrug. I don't have any angle to go on. And there was another thing, Doreen said with a sigh. Penny was hoping that because of my association with you, and how the heck does everybody know about that, she was hoping I might have access to Johnny's cold case file. But, which you know I can't give you, he said firmly. I told her that. I did explain that I couldn't do much, she said. She seems to think I can do more than I can. But knowing you, he said, you'll do your best anyway.